we would have a little conversation
Yes, and we decided when we spoke earlier that we're going to read a little piece and maybe show us some images so that everyone can have a sense of what the work is like. They are here in these two beautiful books. Both are the Provoke 1 and Provoke 2, and we will talk about that too. But maybe just get a sense of what your work is, what you're thinking.
Absolutely. I was hoping maybe Amy can pass along a few copies to the audience. You know, browse the books while you're looking at the slideshow.
Just press play.
And that's on the right.
No, left. Stop. No, further right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So the ideas for the zine actually came about first, and it came out when I was at there's a place in New York. It's run by a really interesting gentleman and also his team. And they opened up a little gallery space on Dashboard Projects. I just finished teaching I think it was the day after my birthday. I just finished teaching at the International Center of Photography, which I was a student of. So it was early in the morning, and I was waiting for Dashboard Projects to open. So I go inside, and I look at all these pictures, and they seem surprisingly. I always have a nice reaction when I see pictures that are made very casually, but they seem formally very beautiful. And it was an artist called R.V. Markopoulos. The first question I think ever since you go to school to learn photography is like, how does this person survive? Because the idea is that if you're an art photographer, you can be extremely arty, or if you're a commercial photographer, you're probably extremely commercial. So this person was straddling both worlds. He was talking about Zen and sumo and ideas of being in a foreign country without making it super exotic. Yeah, maybe play. So,
Well, you have the books to look at.
yeah, and I can keep pressing the space bar.
Yeah, whenever you remember, exactly.
Whenever I remember.
Yeah.
So I think, this picture particularly is something that I feel fits that. It's something that's extremely old, but also kind of contemporary. I haven't been home for a while. This is not the place where I grew up. But somehow just it's imbued with all this sense of cinema, these stories. So when I come to Calcutta, or if I come to America, for example, the architecture of the place is somewhat alien. And it is alien because it's beyond my time. But somehow or the other, something has happened that these narrative stories of people sitting inside that space, people who lived out their lives, has played out. And these are the stories that we talk about. These are the stories that we hear in the news. So that's what happened when I made the zine, I think, is because I was grappling with being in New Haven, a place which has all this Yale architecture. And it has, actually maybe we should play the zine. And this architecture of New Haven is extremely yeah, that's true. Yeah, let's just let this fade this way because you can fix this, but it'll probably take too long. Okay. Yeah. So here, you got it sideways. So I think that's what it is. You're in this architecture, in this space, and you don't know exactly what to do with this landscape. But at the same time, all the stories that you're telling are people who are here, and then how do you package that? So you wrote something in response to it. And it's basically, it's about the fold probably.
Yeah.
That we spoke about. So the momentary fold where two objects emerge, tectonic plates, cultures mix, probably too poetically, as ice or warm cold water, brackish sea, sweet river. This has this effect of life, but it also has its emotions and its tenure. When making pictures of zines, probably a byproduct of a school format, but also depends the news being away from home and considering action in twofold afternoons. There's always a catalyst for even the best laid plans to change. In the context of the images in the book on the zine, I was astounded by sheer number of people it took to serve these causes, functions, celebrations, the Indian Asian term of a function, where it's a gala, but also these morose faces have probably been there too long, or were either too young, or possibly they're a bit too late waiting for the rest of their party. Waiting for the anxious, soothing sounds of the birds chirping in the morning. These lives, not unlike the water or tectonic plates, do collide slowly, but over time the architecture of the city shifts. I don't think I was ever so conscious of it, as I spent most of my 35th birthday in India. When some of these pictures were made, or when I remembered my brief time at Opal House, a squat, self-proclaimed radical folk, zip-lined along Douglas firs and redwood trees, all for an effort to deprive you of your morning toilet paper, or of the French paper that this book is printed on, or the wooden houses, homes, God knows what else, because the essentials do matter, right? Overall, this seems the right space to profess a desire or even a plea to consider all of these far-flung ideas, possibly germinating in architecture or design labs, in order to speak of the current moment in a journalistic fashion, but also ideas that could change that. Cool. Apologies for this sideways glance. I think it was media somewhere, but I won't. But if you can look at the zine, I'm going to flip to the one that's actually not sideways. And this is back home again. So the zine is mostly New England, and it's mostly pictures of traveling. So there's a couple in the UK. There's one landscape, which I think is extremely old. It's by a bridge that's considered like a heritage landmark in the Lake District. There's one photograph of a chef who's about to get married. And it's multiple exposure, and she's really happy, and she's like, this is my last day before it's Christmas. While this is a picture of the Statesman House in Kolkata, it's a newspaper which ran for a very long time. They actually used to report on a lot of very interesting topics, which I think that current newspapers tend not to, and they no longer exist, partly because I think they subscribe to responsibility. Picture of a peacock next to the Audubon engravings. I think just the fact of what we think of as new acquisitions and we keep in like sort of mod spaces, but also you can find anything. You can find like a dodo, like mostly birds. Yeah, and then like the white hibiscus is interesting. I mean, it's interesting that in America I can often find things that I can also find at home, but probably in like botanical gardens, different spaces. So this white hibiscus is again in that same house, which was in the first photograph. It's something, I'm not even sure if that's local or whether it was originally a red hibiscus. Or hibiscus is interesting. These pictures, as I was speaking to Kishwar, are somewhat not mediated. I think some of my other portraits can be a discussion or a conversation. Well, these are more like I showed up for a different purpose and I just had my camera and everybody's kind of dealing with it. So it's funny because I think the person in the middle is making sweets, and it's a religious alley, and I think that's where I got the name Miracle Alley. It's because this alley is being kind of demolished in order to turn it into a space for more aesthetic or more functional space, where the government is coming in, they're like, okay, we're going to make this so that more people can come through. So it's meant for people flow. Well, this was originally how it was many years ago, and people just like made their little stalls next to each other. They were a little unhappy that they had to move to the back of the temple as opposed to the front of it. This is a picture from home. It's during the Omicron variant COVID thing. When I was visiting, I think it was interesting that like Sharma, who was our cook and still is, would come in the morning, make some food, and then leave, but would have a COVID mask on. And also, you know, like that's kind of gives you a good idea of what the kitchen looks like actually. It's like a little mesh, it's very see-through, it's like we use glass bottles and vegetables seeping in water before you cut them. And that specific blade is very traditional.
So we could keep talking about each of the images,
Yeah.
but I'm going to stop you. Because just because I know we've run late and I want also time for the audience to ask you questions, so if that's okay.
Yeah.
We can keep going. This is just an incredible body of work already. And I thought that maybe I could provoke a few questions from you as well, and that just to sort of help us direct some of the work and entry into it. When we were talking, so we had a quick chat before, but I've had the pleasure of seeing you working upstairs and downstairs during the keyhole residency. And I think what's also interesting is that while these have become distilled into very small and very intimate books, many of your paintings and your photographs, you blow up into very large, almost life-size images. So there's this issue of scale that is going on, and that I want to, when we talk a little bit, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the formal aspects. But maybe to start, you were telling me about the inspiration for Provoke and Title Moridiana's work in the magazine, that the full title of which I looked up was Provocative Materials for Thought, and this was a very important magazine that became quite influential, especially in the 70s, as a way of changing the way that we think about Japanese photography. But a sentence came out of it that, in my little bit of research, I want to hear you speak more, is that the aim of the magazine, which I think only had like 3 or 4 issues, was to free photography from the subservience to the language of words. Right? And so you use terms such as narrative, the stories, all of these things that in our mind we think of as verbal. They are so much tied to language. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how you then recompose these if it's not a story. The work and the juxtapositions really do push us to rethink how we think of linear narratives and linearity itself, because it goes back and forth, it disrupts, you surprise us, and that is precisely what the serial nature of these images is doing. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the choice of the term and what you were thinking of the provocation.
Yeah, Moriyama, in a certain way, specifically not just Moriyama.
It's a collective. Yeah.
It's the collective, and it's that aesthetic. And I think mostly this photographer called Fukase, or even other photographers who are women photographers, Japanese women photographers, the graphical quality of these images transcended words. I think while in some of my pictures that is something that is evident, let's say, I mean, even this to a certain extent. And I think you're coming closer to it if you come to images like this. But what I think you're trying to get at is something that I think words are interesting, but the problem is it requires a certain amount of energy to orate. It requires a recording medium. I think writing or language in today's terms has, I think photography, the veracity of photography is completely blown up. So I think I want to find this balance between this graphical space, which could be pleasurable and could be pleasurable to look at, which probably this picture does, while it speaks of that morning cup of tea. And I think there is a long tradition of European photographers making pictures in India. I don't know what that tradition of, I mean, I'm from that space, the largest, the oldest continuously running photo studio is Bowman Shepherd in Calcutta. And it's all plate cameras. Most of these pictures are made with like a wooden plate camera, which is very different from how Geiger worked. He worked with like a Ricoh GR camera, 28mm lens, walking around like prowling the streets at night. But some of these pictures were made, especially these ones when I was younger, was made in that format. It was made in a time in which I was probably trying to come to terms with the fact that I graduated from an undergrad degree. I was not sure about what my function in society was. My idea was always that I would be in some business where I could do design-oriented related work, and I was in construction and real estate stuff. But what happened is I had to come to terms with the labor, and I had to come to terms with like how other people were fulfilling that function and how there was a certain energy involved in it. And that energy, part of it was like walking the streets and trying to find that graphical medium form. We changed when I came to the Indian photo program, and specifically also America. It changed when I bought a slightly larger camera. And I think that's when the idea of the words or narration became different, because in a large format picture, you tend to walk the space. You tend to construct it in terms of the alley that we spoke of. Like, so the diagonals and like the spaces, and then it's a larger picture. Because you can make this extremely large print without seeing the grain, and you're using a 300mm lens as a normal, which is a really long lens, but what it does is it provides an aesthetic value to a human being. When this is shot with a smaller camera, and the way your body functions is different.
I mean, it's definitely that. I mean, the term that gets used quite often, you know, as an architect, as an architectural historian, is the sense of embodiment, right? Like how one embodies a space, but also, as you sort of talked about, thinking about words such as affect, or emotion or sensation, which are, you know, depending on your philosophy or where your sort of cultural background is absolutely non-verbal. It's almost pre-verbal, you know. I mean, philosophers have written about this, like what are we before words? I mean, do we exist? It's an existential question, right? Is it possible for us to be without words? And so, you know, like we can go on about like what does that mean on that existential level. But you also use now, so you know, I'm just bringing up a few topics because we could talk for a long time. We have a little bit. But the other part that I wanted to think about, which is a completely different aspect of this idea of we and the verbal and the non-verbal and narrative, but also the word you use, street, is so much a part of this too. So it's been talked about, especially this little one, I thought it was so interesting because it's very timely, it's very time-based, and then it gives us these interesting sort of reliefs from time. You suddenly have color in here. But Nick Mirzov talks about, you know, had established a book called The Right to See, and Who Has the Right to See was, you know, sort of coming at the about the same time as the Occupy movement and how we occupy our spaces and how we think about even looking, you know, we were talking also, maybe we were, but you know, like in some way, if you make eye contact with the wrong person, your life could be in danger, right? So this idea of who gets to see, what you get to see, and how then you represent it, is part of this idea of the street, right? The street photography. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the visual politics of your work and how you're sort of entering. I mean, to enter into home and to be in Calcutta is a very different experience than to be in those forests or to even be in the Haven through your own embodied and positional, you know, identity, I guess could be one word we came up with.
Let's start with the first one. The existential quandary is something that I think in photography has this, just in my practice, has this duality. One is specifically, if I feel I can make pictures of a certain dynamic quality, I can make provocative documents even though they're not that provocative, or they might be provocative to somebody, or they're just documents. And what is provocative in form of a document? So that being said, then I come into other dynamics of existence. And I think since I was a kid, I've always not been a follower of such. Like, there's a doubt factor involved. It's always like, okay, like, what is this? And maybe sometimes it's not helpful in terms of like getting something done. But the doubt helps in terms of other functions, right? And I think it's interesting because I expected America to be a different space in terms of those structures or formats. I knew that those structures and formats existed, but they always existed in terms of like a left wing or a right wing, or in terms of a political identity, or in terms of like other identities of capitalism or commerce or a certain bend, and how much does that bend give and what fulfills the function bend. But in terms of these ideas, it's fine, but like when you're actually doing something, there's not such a big difference, but that there is a difference in terms of class, in terms of in India specifically. It's like the point is if you have, and even in America, yeah, I think it happens is like if you are a photographer and if you can own a camera, you already come to this space where you are in this industry or function. And if you're, especially if you're not a studio photographer, And if I was a studio photographer, and I think in the future bodies of work, and probably like in the many reels of films that are lying in the basement here, there are pictures of studios in India. And I think that was something that, even like if you look at people like Alexander, the way that they could do that series of the project was because they were a studio photographer, they could fund it with that, but that also built an aesthetic. Like we spoke about a couple of the portraits here. I think this is a very casual portrait, and I think this is a fun portrait for me to take. Because this person's working, I'm here at a hostel, it's like a pretty cheap accommodation situation, off season, they're about to go home, and they're about to get married. So I'm like, okay, having this very informal chat with this person and having this photograph. While in this space, and that brings that existential quandary, it's because like all of us have probably a different engagement with different people. It's
this is really incredible. Yes.
Yeah, so this is just opposite this space where my uncle has been going to keep his shoes and all of that stuff when he goes to the temple. And the Kali temple is something that has a specific relation to Bengali culture. It's almost like a tantric goddess, right? So she's like this dark version of Parvati or Durga, and she's basically lost her mind. And she's lost her mind because she's been unleashed to kill or vanquish evil or demons that have overrun the earth. And the idea is that nobody else can defeat these people. So let's invoke Kali. But then what happens is Kali goes on a rampage, kills all the civilians, and then her consort or Shiva or whatever is lying on the ground, going like, okay, like maybe she won't kill me, maybe she will, and if she does, then it's fine. But so then Kali steps out of Shiva, and then the tongue comes out, going like, oh, yeah. I almost killed like this one person who I care about. So that's kind of interesting because like who you care about it, like where do you go with this practice, or what are you trying to get with it? Because I think it's great to provoke, or it's great to like do a lot of other things, but at the same time then you're also in that society.
Yeah, I mean it's the sense of destruction, right? I mean there's this sense of disruption and destruction. And that's part of what I wanted to also make. It's nice that you brought this up because it's true that the story is incomplete, right? Because the temple is back here. We wouldn't know that it's en route to a temple, right? Necessarily, all of those things, and there's this incompletion to it. But those figures that we were both so taken by, they create this field that you cannot go by. I think if anyone's looking at it, there's a certain sort of depth to this paint. I'm sorry, to the last page. Sorry, but to this photograph, but they are really confrontational and yet not. And so there's this, it creates these picture planes that I think are so fascinating. Just again, in the gaze and the way in which they look, and we were talking about this, who gets to look. And they tell you no, or they are saying yes. But it could go both ways. And it's that brings up this question of subjecthood, right? And looking back. And so also, as you mentioned, the space class is very much a part of it, right? So they are looking at you, you've got a camera, you sort of have access. How much can you tell you not to, right?
Yeah. It's a really funny dynamic because the camera builds in all of this stuff. But the thing is, the person in the middle was like taken by the fact that I have this giant camera and it caused like a bit of a stir. So he was like, no, can you make a picture? You make a picture of me? Yes, great. Like come and I'll sit here, but I have to go out and pick up my kid from school. So there's this time limit. Yes. But there's also the other people who sit next by you laughing and we're like joking and we're like doing the typical Instagram camera thing. And then you're like, I'm sorry, but this camera doesn't allow you to do this. It's something that's like extremely like long exposure, slow stuff. You gotta like slow it down a little bit, and then all of a sudden like people start changing because it's like it's no longer like just a snapshot, and that's that space which I think you can modulate to make it like aesthetic or your own like artwork. But at some point, I think I was in this phase where I was like annoyed with that format, and I was trying to figure out like, oh, can I just like mess with it? So this is what I got. It's just really funny because like if you do this is a place again that gets close to the house. I mean, these are the stories that you mentioned. Nobody's going to know this. And maybe the writing is necessary.
No, I don't think so.
I also don't.
You used to know about this thing, yeah.
So it's again the mishmash of culture. You know ISKCON, you haven't heard of this, have you? Have you seen that a lot of people like in the New York subways who are dressed in like saffron, but they're mostly like people from America. They have a shaped head and they're like little bells and those things. The Hare Krishna.
Yes, the Hare Krishna.
So the Hare Krishnas organize this in Calcutta every year, and it's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger slowly. And I think like in the zine you have this one picture which is off the loudspeaker thing, so it's again a mishmash of culture. So it's like different people coming and like appropriating. Not appropriating, actually, that's the wrong word. I wish I hadn't said that. It's like, it's religion. It's like, what does religion do? Is it like related to like just one country? Because these are the people who like do the loudspeaker stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think this is probably the picture for me, is because okay, like I worked in the construction industry for a bit, but I was a manager, so I wasn't like doing the labor work. But this is like people who are doing labor work, who want their picture taken, but have a certain aesthetic, which is like, why should I make like a happy picture of this moment? But it's also like a formal picture, which is like happy, So,
well, this question of time is so much about your work as well. I mean, it's I've tried to say that in the context of long exposure photography and all of that, but that temporality, I wanted to sort of, maybe also have you talk a little bit about the way in which you chose the books at different moments in your time. Right, some of them, as you mentioned, are from 2017. Some of them are from Pine Plaza last May. There's this sort of, which have a different kind of urgency. Some of them you're sort of looking through and you can sense that you have slowed down. Some of them have to happen quickly. Right, so there's this idea of your own time and your sort of, we talked about the body as a physical thing, but then there's this temporality in your work that I think is so self-reflective, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the process for you of choosing these.
Thank you, that's a fantastic question. I think that's pretty much the entire practice. It's basically like just looking back and thinking. It's not thinking about alternatives, but it's actually thinking about like past time, which is recent, or like moments that are so vivid. In the protest of the Vainiki, which is in the zine mostly, and some of the pictures I've left out, but are extremely momentary. And it's so interesting because it has this atmosphere. And sometimes though the atmosphere reminds you of other memories in the past. And then again, sometimes it's lacking. And there's this lull. And then you almost wish for it to amp up again. But maybe, that's the thing. It's like the ebbs and flows, right? Like when you're looking back at your own life, like what do you really think about? What are the moments that you think about, and like what are the photographs? Because I think a lot of people say that like when you have pictures, you don't really remember the moment. I completely disagree. I think it comes back to what you are doing and like other things. So I don't know, to come back to it, I think the formal characteristics of the pictures are extremely important, but I really love the mistakes. I love the long exposures, I love the little bits of water that hit something by mistake and then it gets like actually in the picture. Because I think like it's all like such a messy process. But it's also like, the memes about this on Instagram. It's like you're a photographer and like, yes, what have you sacrificed to do this? You don't really sacrifice anything. But the problem is because it's such a material form. And I don't know if this is true for painting because I know that like the price of materials is expensive and everything. But it's just that it's such a, like you expose it to light. And you just hope that you have this andas, that like this estimation, that you can get it somewhere there. And I think music, or especially like maybe instrumental music, can come to that effect, or even like maybe like vocals, because you're like this person is like getting there. But you're trying to get these tones out in something, and then you're trying to modulate this to an audience. Because after a point, like you can be really happy with a lot of things because you have all this context.
Well, I think one of the things that I find so interesting about your work, and as our conversation is unfolding, is that, within this sort of history of photography, it has been presented as this almost heroic field, right, associated with masculinity of a certain type, right, and of a certain type of performance, because of the instrument, about also just the ability to carry it. There's a certain sort of, I would say, arrogance, right, in the perform, and this is not true, but in the way in which the field of photography sometimes, became mythologized. But this is also the 1950s, and sort of very much about a particular culture in America, say, for example, in terms of reference now.
I think it's all over the world.
Yeah, and maybe exactly. So maybe that's what it is also. I've seen all the studio photography works that are in Africa also, which are sort of very similarly performative in that way. But what you're alluding to it is the process of humility, right? That you actually have the least control. In some ways, you can do as much as you can. You can sort of, and chance, right? It's a game in a certain level, but it's just how one exists in the world of pulling back and actually, here I am, I'm being part of this world, I'm part of this thing, as well as capturing it and being documentary in that way, right? And I think that's sort of, to me at least, a lot of your work sort of brings in that kind of opening and an invitation that I think is really generous, personally.
Thank you, Rizvi. I think that was a big quandary. I think in the beginning when I first came across it, especially with the 35mm camera or things like that issue wasn't really such an issue. Because it was so fleeting and walking and in the street, and especially as you mentioned, provoke and Lego, that allows that freedom. Because all of a sudden you're more like just passing by. So the moment you change that format and you start like speaking with them, so you put the tripod down, then all of a sudden you're again in this strange colonial format where, and it's even before photography was a thing. It's the idea of depicting a place and then transporting that image across somewhere so that there can be some financial reward in some respect, probably in relation to industry. But in my respects, because that's no longer the function. And some of those ideas of beauty or aesthetics and other domains don't really interest me from that time period, maybe 2016 and 2015. But it did because of being in the landscape. That's a constant thing because being a guy, being in India, having these class issues, and also trying to figure out different ways of talking about current issues, right? Which is a lot of gender, women issues in Calcutta, especially safety issues. And then like maybe that's when photography's other domains come in, where you have pictures like this, which is again a digital picture passing by, but then it's like a religious picture, and that's for a different purpose. It's to cover your face thing before the religious ceremony happens because there's makeup on it and stuff like that. But that has so many connotations, right? Especially with like women's safety in India, and especially with what's going on in that right now. And then you've got.
We have basically five.
Maybe we open it up to the.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping, that maybe we could maybe we can get 5 minutes extra since we started so late. I think I would love to have a little bit of time to also engage.
Yeah.
This is a very rich body of work, and obviously to be continued with many conversations. But I'd like to invite you if you be out here, maybe do ask some questions.
Very good.
As we speak
I have a question.
And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, just so we don't all know you.
I'm Maria, I'm an artist.
Lovely.
Thank
you for being here.
So I'm very curious about these language, so visual language, the language of words, and maybe you guys will talk a little bit more about what happens to the narrative when we remove the words, and then why our words may be more or less important. Memory, narrative.
Yeah, for me, I think it's a book format, and then it changes. When I was making that, and I'm making another one, but it's double-sided this time, so it changes everything. It's not just the association with the fact that this is like staple, but it's also got half a picture on this page, and then the other half of the picture carries on. So it's beautiful when you see it as a fragment because it doesn't make any sense. And then somehow or the other, when you put it together and you put the staple on it, it works in this beautiful way where it just flows. So I think the zine format, even though it's much derided by most people because it's like, what do we do with it? It takes so much space, and people actually want to buy it. Is interesting because give it away, it's not very expensive, and it has this beautiful little staple format, which I don't think, and I think there are more precious objects. But the narration of this specifically, I think, is extremely functional because all of a sudden you don't really see the picture anymore. So I think that then your brain doesn't. And it's very much about perception. So you're walking around the street and then all of a sudden like you have a different perception about the space and a lot of things that you never noticed earlier. And maybe you did, but then you had a different thought about it. And I think it's a constant process for all of us. So I think
the question, is also just like how conscious is one of perception, of what one perceives. It's like, maybe that's what you're thinking of too.
Is that, yeah.
Well, I mean, this is really interesting question, right? So if you remove the words, do you actually provoke more perceiving, intuition,
exactly.
emotion? I mean, we're into space and how the body is embodied in that. what happens with what we're moving with. I'm just,
Yeah.
something I'm thinking deeply about and really struck by
Yeah.
as you guys talk.
It's something I have to think about in museums. You think about this, like when I go somewhere, it's like you read the placard, you see the object,
Yeah.
you do both at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? I think you would probably all have very different answers, but it's also the reason why you're there every time is different, right? Why you're there, what expectations you brought to that object, to that work of art is, every work is different, and it provokes a different kind of response, and some of them you just want to look at and you want to know what is this thing, it's a different question.
Partially already answered the question, but I'm Leslie, also an artist. And I wanted to ask you, Amartya, how you conceive of the difference between a zine and a photo book, and why you chose to go in those two different directions with these, or you came up with different with those formats.
Yeah, I think the photo book I was probably a little more familiar with as a consumer. In terms of the zine, most of the zines that I was looking at was more text heavy. And even when it had images, it had poetry or other text in it. Till I went to that show Dashboard and I saw these zines which I liked. I was also a little bit on the fence about like picking up one of them, particularly because it was probably like so it was like $30. I was like, okay, then you have to add taxes to it, and I was like, okay, it's like a thing. I wish I picked it up now, honestly. But then I didn't pick it up then because I take my time with these things usually, and then I went to the Bindkey and I researched the person who made the zines. And I found I was expecting a photo book, but then a zine showed up in a box. And then I posted it on Instagram, and then this friend I went to school with a while ago made a comment. He's like, "Where did you find this?" Big exclamation point. And then I realized that, oh my god, this means so much to so many people. So I went a bit more into the zine making. And the idea is basically it's the fold. It's usually it's in divisions of 4, because you need at least 4 pages to make a zine. And then you make sure that this fits into a PDF or a design document. You can appropriate the paper if you're in an art residency or somewhere, or you can buy it from this French paper or something like that. And then you basically find the laser printer. The inkjet's gone through very well. You can probably find other printing methods, but it's very guerrilla. It's exactly. And then it's funny because when I went to staple it, I had to go back to GHP, and then there's always these interactions. So I think photo making is often even with the camera, I'm kind of removed from the people I'm making the pictures of. But especially if I'm using a 8x10 with a dark clock. But if I'm in the space of making a zine or something like that, I'm at Tyco. Or I'm at the epicenter in the middle of the night, and Mimi and I are trying to buy these transfers for this laser printer that I got from CCAM for free. It doesn't work. So these little dimensions are actually making an object really pretty.
The guerrilla part is really interesting. And I think one of the things I would love for us to really leave everyone with, and maybe we should have to ask about it, that we didn't get to talk about, but we actually started our conversation about the fold. And the idea, Deleuze talks about the fold as being the space of power, that the fold becomes, and thank you for bringing up the sort of object, these two very different types of objects. But there are all kinds of things since it's Sunday. I can think about the fold that we are gathered here as kind of a collective of some sort. The fold can at the same time be about kinship, but it can also be of yielding. In slang, you would say the fold. You fold it. You fold it. You said, I can't be there anymore, right? So there are all of these different ways of imagining a word that we all think of so familiar. That I think what your zine does, as well as the history book, but in such different ways, is to disrupt down expectations of what that could be. But go forward and first work today.
Well, that's very cool because there's different ways of thinking about it, right? As you said, one is fold, and you give up, and it's also terminology. Exactly. But also, it could be just this crevice that you've fallen in with a whole bunch of other people or other things. I think I'll leave it open because I think that's not my description to give, but it's whatever it means to everyone else. And
but I think that's the beauty of your work. It honestly is this generosity of opening it up, allowing others to play with your word and words, but also to open up your word in ways that I think the provocation.
Yeah, I want to end with one thing. This last bit is really important for me. It's when I was photographing these ciphers in Calcutta, and it's one of the things I can't do because I'm here. But maybe I'll and it's hard to find it in the specific terminology. And specifically this picture, because I think it comes back to that idea of before, that's a very old logo. It used to be my great granddad's little magazine, and where it gives you the sun, it gives you the entire landscape, and it gives you this word in Bengali which says Udoy, which is like the rising. And it's usually like the little magazine movement back in the 1910s was dealing with colonialism in a very ever-present way. Even though they were profiting off colonialism in a way, the writing was very, because the business otherwise wouldn't function, the writing in it was very anti-colonialism. And maybe that's what it is. It's like you use the materials to function, but then at the same time you try to speak about it without putting yourself, putting the subjects in the box that they exist in. Maybe.
Subversive.
Yeah, but like I feel that it's so, like if I keep saying subversive and I'm not subversive, it's like
No, exactly. I just threw that as a being facetious. But I want to. We could talk all the day long, but thank you all for being here. These are on sale, so if you want
$10, $40.
yes, please.
All proceeds go to the artist.
Yes, yes, and all those nice French stapling. We have such a long program, so we kind of decided to do that.
So we're going to have to take about 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes to transition to our next set of speakers. And please feel free to help yourself to suites in the foyer, laundry from clothing, and let's meet back here at